Welcome to the History and Heritage podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time. Welcome back to our podcast series on the Russian Revolution. In today's episode, we'll explore the period of dual power between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet, and the growing influence of the Bolsheviks. In our previous episode, we covered the February Revolution and the fall of the Tsar. Remember how the Tsar's abdication was greeted with widespread jubilation? Sadly, this euphoria was short-lived as Russia faced immense challenges. We discussed the deep-seated problems that led to the Tsar's downfall: food shortages, war weariness, and lack of faith in the leadership. Let's briefly recap the key events and figures so we can understand the environment into which dual power emerged. The February Revolution was not a planned event, but rather a spontaneous uprising. It was triggered by a combination of economic hardship, social unrest, and military defeats. The Tsar's government was unable to cope with these challenges, leading to its collapse. The key figures in the February Revolution included workers and soldiers who took to the streets to protest, members of the Duma who formed the Provisional Government, and socialist leaders who organized the Petrograd Soviet. Today we'll examine the complex period following the revolution, known as the era of dual power. This period is often overlooked, overshadowed by the dramatic events of October, but it was a critical turning point that shaped the future of Russia. The dual power setup was a unique historical phenomenon. It created constant tension and uncertainty, ultimately leading to a new upheaval. The dual power system was characterized by the existence of two competing centers of authority: the Provisional Government, which was the formal government of Russia, and the Petrograd Soviet, which was a council of workers and soldiers' deputies. These two bodies had different goals and priorities, leading to constant conflict and instability. This period of dual power lasted from March to October 1917, setting the stage for the Bolshevik seizure of power. The seeds of the October Revolution were sown during this period. The decisions made, the alliances forged, and the conflicts that erupted all played a role. We will trace the arc of the events that led to the Bolshevik takeover in this episode. The Provisional Government, representing the educated elite, struggled to maintain control. Meanwhile, the Petrograd Soviet, representing the workers and soldiers, demanded influence. This competition for authority created instability. It showed deep divisions within Russian society, and it undermined the government's abilities to govern effectively. The Bolsheviks, initially a minority party, seized on the chaos and discontent. Through skilled propaganda and effective organization, they gained popularity. They rallied the population, promising a radical solution to Russia's problems. The Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies was established on February 27, 1917, according to the old calendar. This was during the height of the February Revolution. The old calendar date corresponds to March 12th in the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use. The Soviet emerged as a spontaneous response to the collapse of the Tsarist regime. The collapse of the Tsarist regime created a power vacuum. Various groups and organizations sought to fill this vacuum, and the Petrograd Soviet was one of the most important of these groups. It emerged spontaneously during the February Revolution as workers and soldiers sought representations. Even some intellectuals felt they lacked a voice in the new political order. They felt left behind by the politicians of the Duma and had serious grievances, and the Soviet provided a forum for them to express their grievances. The workers and soldiers had specific demands: an end to the war, improved working conditions, land redistribution, and greater political participation. The Soviet initially met in the Tauroid Palace, the same building as the State Duma. This location was symbolic, highlighting the parallel existence of the two centers of power. The Duma represented the more traditional political forces, while the Soviet represented the revolutionary masses. The proximity of the two bodies led to frequent interactions. These interactions became crucial in the unfolding of the political drama. The Soviet quickly grew to include over 3,000 deputies, with one deputy for every 1,000 worker or soldiers. This rapid growth demonstrated the widespread support for the Soviet among the working class and the military. The size of the Soviet made it kind of awkward and unwieldy, which led to the creation of a smaller executive body. The immense size also showed the degree to which the Russian population was engaged in revolution. The deputies to the Soviet were elected by workers in the factories and soldiers in the military units. The election process for the time was relatively democratic. It gave ordinary people a direct voice in the political process. The Soviet formed an executive committee called an isполком on March the 1st to manage its day-to-day affairs. It was designed to make quick decisions and coordinate Soviet activities. It became the primary voice of the Soviet in its dealings with the Provisional Government. This was a crucial step in consolidating the Soviet's power. The isполком was composed of leading figures from the various socialist parties. It played a key role in the shaping of the Soviet's policies and strategies. Initially, the isполком included representatives from various socialist parties, with each party given 3 seats. This reflects the dominance of socialist ideologies within the Soviet movement. The most prominent parties, as you would expect, were the Mensheviks, with also a group called the Social Revolutionaries being prominent. The Bolsheviks were in the minority, but their influence would end up growing rapidly. The socialist parties had different views on how to achieve socialism. The Mensheviks favoured a gradual approach. The SRs, or Social Revolutionaries, focused on a land reform, and the Bolsheviks advocated for immediate revolution. Key figures in the early isполком included Nikolai Chikidze, who was the chairman, and Alexander Kerensky, the vice chairman. Chikidze was a Menshevik, and he was a respected figure within the socialist movements. Kerensky, who initially was a socialist revolutionary, was a charismatic orator who played a crucial role in the Provisional Government. These leaders would play a pivotal role in the events to come. The isполком became a key decision-making body, often rivaling the authority of the provisional governments. The provisional government, formed by members of the Duma, lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many of the workers and soldiers. The isполком tried to fill this power vacuum, and it issued its own decrees and directives, often clashing with those of the provisional government. And thus, the dual power system had been born. The provisional government was largely composed of members of the educated elite, and it lacked a strong connection to the working class and the peasantry. The isполком, on the other hand, was closely connected to these groups, and this gave it a significant advantage in terms of popular support. The isполком initially took a radical stance, issuing orders that often contradicted the provisional government. The isполком saw itself as the true representative of the revolutionary masses. It was willing to challenge the authority of the provisional government, and it reflected the demands of the workers and soldiers who made up its base. On March the 1st, the isполком published the controversial Order No. 1, which gave the Soviet control over military units. Order No. 1 was a watershed moment in the Russian Revolution. It fundamentally altered the power dynamics within the military. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the officer corps, because it instructed soldiers and sailors to obey only those orders from the provisional government that did not contradict the decrees of the Soviet, and it also called for the creation of soldiers' committees in all military units. These committees were given authority to elect their own officers. This order effectively undermined the provisional government's authority of the armed forces. The instruction to obey only the instructions that the Soviets agreed with led to widespread insubordination and breakdown of military discipline. This made it difficult for the provisional government to prosecute the war effort, and it handed the Soviet considerable control of the armed forces. The Provisional Government actually was committed to continuing the war against Germany, but Order Number 1 made it nearly impossible to enforce military discipline and maintain an effective fighting force. The Ispolikom also established workers' militias and took control of the railways and telegraphs. These actions further expanded the Ispolikom's power and influence, and workers' militias often provided a means of maintaining order, and also protected workers' rights. Controls of the railways and telegraphs allowed Ispolikom to control the flow of information and transportation of goods and people. The Ispolikom implemented the 8-hour workday that the Petrograd factories had been looking for. It was a clear demonstration of the Ispolikom's commitment to improving the lives of the workers, and unsurprisingly, it boosted the Ispolikom's popularity. Over time, the Ispolikom's influence became more conservative as it sought to maintain stability. The leaders of the Ispolikom came to believe that it was necessary to cooperate with the Provisional Government. They feared that further radical actions would lead to chaos and civil war. This shift towards moderation alienated some of their more radical supporters. They were trying to balance competing interests and prevent greater instability. The Mensheviks and SRs, who dominated the Ispolikom, believed that Russia was not ready for a socialist revolution. They felt it was necessary to work with the bourgeoisie to establish a democratic republic. By April, it had expanded to include 19 members, with representation from both workers and soldiers. This expansion reflected the growing complexity of the political landscape, and the leaders of the Ispolikom sought to represent a wider range of interests. The Ispolikom's shift towards moderation reflected the dominance of the Menshevik and SR leaders. These parties believed in a more gradual transition to socialism, and they felt it was necessary to work with the bourgeoisie. They believed Russia lacked the economic and social conditions for a socialist revolution. The main reason the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries initially dominated Soviet leadership was because they had been involved in Russian revolutionary politics for longer than the Bolsheviks, and therefore their leaders were more experienced and better known. The Mensheviks and SRs, which again was socialist revolutionaries, had a long history of involvement in Russian revolutionary movements, and they had participated even in the 1905 revolution, which I talked about in a previous episode, and had built up a network of supporters and activists. They supported cooperation with bourgeoisie, believing Russia wasn't ready for socialist transformation, and they also adhered to a Marxist theory that Russia needed to first develop a capitalist economy before transitioning to socialism. They felt it was necessary to work with the Provisional Government, and also felt it was necessary to establish a stable democratic republic. They argued that Russia needed to first undergo a period of capitalist development before it could transition to socialism. Key Menshevik theorists like Georgy Plekhanov argued for a bourgeois democratic stage of revolution. Plekhanov was a leading figure in the Russian socialist movement. He felt that Russia was too backward to skip the capitalist stage of development, and his views influenced the Menshevik strategy of cooperation with the Provisional Government. Speaking of the Provisional Government, the Provisional Government formed by members of the old Duma lacked legitimacy and popular support. The Provisional Government was composed largely of liberals and moderate socialists, and it was not elected by the people, and this lack of democratic legitimacy undermined its authority. It was intended to be temporary, pending the election of a constituent assembly, and its actual primary task was to organise elections for a constituent assembly, which then would draft a new constitution and establish a permanent government. However, the Provisional Government kept delaying these elections, and this fueled public discontent, as you would expect, because they just wanted the power. It faced immense challenges: continuing the war, economic crisis, and land distribution. The Provisional Government inherited, you could say, a country plagued by problems. The war was going badly, the economy was in a shambles, peasants were demanding land. The Provisional Government was unable to solve these problems, and therefore these problems eroded its credibility. Its decision to continue the war was deeply unpopular and fueled anti-government sentiment, as the Russian people were tired of the war because they had suffered immense losses in every way, shape and form. They were, even at that stage, were still experiencing severe economic hardship, and the decision to continue the war was seen as a betrayal of the people's interests. The government's commitment to fulfilling its international obligations clashed with desires for peace. The Provisional Government felt bound to honour Russia's treaties with its allies, and these treaties committed Russia to continuing the war. However, the Russian people just wanted an end to the war immediately. This conflict between the government's obligations and the people's desire further undermined its authority. Delaying land reform angered the peasantry, who wanted immediate redistribution of land. The peasants made up the vast majority of the Russian population, and they had long demanded land redistribution. However, the Provisional Government postponed this decision until the Constituent Assembly could meet. This angered the peasants and led to widespread land seizures by the peasants. The Cadets, who were Constitutional Democrats, a liberal party, dominated the early Provisional Government. They were committed to establishing a constitutional monarchy in Russia. Their dominance in the Provisional Government reflected the initial strength of the liberal forces in the revolution. Later, socialist leaders like Alexander Kerensky joined, but the government remained ineffective. Kerensky was a charismatic and popular figure. His entry into the government was intended to broaden its base of support. However, even with Kerensky's leadership, the Provisional Government failed to gain the confidence of the people. And because of the laws drawn up by the Soviets mentioned previously, the Provisional Government actually lacked the means to enforce its authority consistently. While the Provisional Government and the Soviet debated, Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia in April 17 from exile in Switzerland. The German government had allowed him to travel through Germany in what was termed a sealed train, and all of the press were very upset at this because the Germans secretly hoped that Lenin's return would destabilize Russia. He issued the April Theses, a radical program calling for immediate socialist revolution. The April Theses outlined Lenin's vision and, among other things, called for an end to the war, land to peasants, and power to the Soviets. Peace, land and bread became the Bolshevik slogan, resonating with soldiers, workers and everyone else alike. The slogan was simple and effective. It captured the key demand of the people and it helped the Bolsheviks to gain popularity. But the Bolsheviks also advocated for all power to the Soviets, calling for the Provisional Government's overthrow. The Bolsheviks believed the Soviets represented the Russian people and not the Provisional Government, and they advocated transferring all power to the Soviets. Lenin's stance set the Bolsheviks apart. The Mensheviks and SRs were willing to work with the Provisional Government, but the Bolsheviks refused to compromise. They demanded the government's immediate overthrow. The Bolsheviks gained influence within the Soviets, as they were skilled organizers. The Kornilov affair, where a general in the army, General Kornilov, attempted a military coup, damaged the Provisional Government and boosted the Bolsheviks' popularity. And why, you may ask? Simply, he tried the military coup and the Provisional Government couldn't actually defend itself or defend Petrograd, and they called on the Bolsheviks to defend Petrograd. And therefore, people were looking at it going, what are the Provisional Government trying to defend like that for? They need help from the Bolsheviks, they're no good. So, to summarise the period of dual power, the period of dual power was one of instability and growing radicalization. The Provisional Government's weaknesses created opportunities for the Bolsheviks, and Lenin's leadership helped them gain popular support. The events of this period set the stage for the October Revolution. Dum dum dum! And next time, we'll delve into the October Revolution itself, where we'll analyse the Bolsheviks' strategies and tactics because they were the main guys in it. Thank you for listening. Join us next time as we continue exploring the Russian Revolution.